Hello and welcome to Dialogue Gospel Study for June 14th, 2026 with Tanya Wells Brown. I'm Christian Kimball. I'm joined today by David Sandberg as hosts of this Dialogue Gospel Study program brought to you by the Dialogue Foundation Board. Susie Greco, who recently taught a Dialogue Gospel Study lesson just last December, is here with us for an invocation and discussion. Tanya Wells Brown is a social worker and public health specialist currently undertaking doctoral research at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She serves as a safeguarding lead for the Diocese of Europe in Portugal, where her work focuses on preventing harm and strengthening safe, accountable practices within faith-based communities. Tanya is part of the community of practice with the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, contributing to global efforts to understand and prevent violence in faith settings, with a particular focus on the intersections of gender, power, and religion. Her work explores how faith spaces can both perpetuate and challenge inequalities, and how safeguarding approaches can be grounded in justice and care. Now, that's all true, and it sounds a little bit like reading a CV. Tanya has promised me that she will introduce herself in a more personal or journey sense as we begin. A word about Dialogue. Dialogue is the oldest independent Mormon studies journal, founded in 1966. In the first issue of the journal, founder Eugene England wrote, "My faith encourages my curiosity and awe. It thrusts me out into relationship with all creation and encourages me to enter into dialogue." Dialogue is fundamentally a quarterly journal, and we encourage you to subscribe. Subscriptions and subscribers are the lifeblood of the journal. All of the journal, almost 60 years, including the most recent issue, which I think the most recent issue will be out today or tomorrow, is available and searchable online without a paywall, as are the digital offerings we produce, including this Gospel Study series. This year marks the 60th anniversary of Dialogue, and in September, we will be celebrating with various events at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. Mark your calendar. We need broad-based financial support to continue. If you appreciate this Dialogue Gospel Study series or the journal, or even just the existence of an independent Mormon studies journal, please support Dialogue. You can access all of the content as well as learn more about donating and about Dialogue itself at dialoguejournal.com. Finally, let me make our standard disclaimer. As noted in every issue of the journal, Dialogue has no official connection with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As we note with every gospel study session, the views expressed today are the speakers alone. We invite teachers and participants for their individual voice, not by institution or as a representative. Individual voice means speakers bring their own training, experience, and point of view. Nobody here speaks for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or for their employer or school. Susie?
Our dear Heavenly Parents, we are very grateful to be gathered here, people from all over the world, to listen to Tanya, to listen and learn about women in the Bible and their experiences, their lived experiences, and relate them to experiences that we are facing and challenges that we face today. May our minds be open and receptive, that as we may feel discomfort, that we might learn and lean into that discomfort and let it work within us, that we might seek to learn and grow and understand thy ways in a way where women may have more justice and more equality within religious organizations. And we pray that thou will bless Tanya. We are incredibly grateful to listen and to hear from her and her expertise and learning, and grateful for her study and preparation for this time together. And we say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Susie. I'm just going to share screen now. Okay. Just going to do a quick forward check just to make sure that I'm on the right slides. Yeah, I am. I'm going to put it on a slideshow. Okay. So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity and the platform to be with you this afternoon and to share with you. My presentation will be on a sort of comparative comparison of Ruth and Judith, two women figures in the Bible. And I will be looking at this through the lens of gender, religion, and power. Christian has already sort of given you an introduction of what I do in my day-to-day work. So I'm going to move swiftly forward and just talk to you how I came to be interested in doing this work and the reason, you know, why I'm here this afternoon. So I grew up in a very sort of conservative Anglican faith. I was fortunate enough to go to a home Sunday school with very safe surroundings, where I learned a great deal and I was able to explore freely without actually any parental interruption as such. It was a homeschool just for children. So I was really blessed that it was a very safe space. As I grew up into my teenage years and I started grappling and reconciling, I had a tension emerge between my faith and how I was becoming and emerging in the world as a feminist and somebody who was specializing in gender equality, and also grappling with some of the emergence of institutional harm that was happening in a lot of faith-based spaces around the world. So this sat really uncomfortably with me for a number of years. I think it's fair to say that I put a block in between my professional life and my faith-based life for many years. And then it started coming together around 10 years ago, where I had the opportunity to be involved in evaluation for World Vision. This evaluation was looking at the role of faith actors actually in preventing gender-based violence, which is what I've been doing for many years, but I've been looking at it through the lens of the space of the health worker. So through that evaluation, what I came to realize was a couple of things. First of all, that faith leaders did have a role to play in this and could do it very well and very effectively because they were the face of the community, if you like. But on the other hand, not very many of them were actually geared up to really fully understand that responsibility and to do it well and to do it safely. And inadvertently, because of this, they were actually perpetuating harm in some cases. So as we sort of come around my circle here, I'm coming into this space where I'm exploring my faith again and how I fit within all of that. And what I wanted was to have a faith that was inclusive and non-judgmental. And I found that in Portugal I could be involved in a community, and those early sort of re-emergence into my faith came about, I guess. What has happened since then is I've had the amazing opportunity, as Susie and Susie knows and Christian introduced, is that I've been working with the Community of Practice and the Sexual Violence Research Institute, and a team of people who have been challenging those norms in and around how faith and the intersection of gender equality actually work, and how we keep women, children safe within these institutions. So I really strive for accountability. I strive for inclusion, and my role as a safeguarding officer through the Diocese of Europe has really enabled that work to come through in a more professional way. I wouldn't say it's easy. There are still some challenges that we come across, and I think one of them is really in and around the very structured way that we're taught about figures and characteristics in the Bible, how we think about gender equality, how we think about patriarchy, and I think this is an area that I'm sort of exploring now. So I just want to caveat this today with I'm not a theologian. I've not studied theology. What you're hearing today is my interpretation of how I would like to see women positioned in the Bible today. And this opportunity to study for this has really opened my eyes and challenged me today. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to Ruth and Judith, and I just want to frame this comparator. But I'm going to start with just reading something to you. For centuries, male figures in the Bible have been freely idolized, updated, turned into leadership models, used as moral examples, applied to modern context. Think of how often people say things like, David shows us how to lead. Moses teaches us courage. Paul is a model for ministry. No one says this is anachronistic. No one says you can't apply this to today. No one says he's lived in a different world. Men have been allowed to travel across time. But women are interpreted differently. We're going to see this now through this framing of Ruth and Judith. So Ruth and Judith represent two distinct but complementary feminist biblical archetypes. One who navigates through loyalty and solidarity and strategic compliance, and one who disrupts it through violence and deception and transgression. Both reveal that religion is simultaneously the instrument of women's oppression and the site of their power. So I think one of the things to really focus on here is that Ruth, and I'm very familiar with Ruth because I grew up in the Anglican sort of system, and so I knew the book of Ruth. It's accepted within the Hebrew Old Testament, and Ruth is presented as a Hebrew heroism and victimhood in a sort of in patriarchal service. Yet I was less familiar with Judith. I had heard of her. She's presented in Orthodox and Catholic biblical texts, but not in the Anglican texts, as I'm more familiar with. She is presented as a warrior, a femme fatale, and an anti-heroine. So we've got two extremely different types of women that I will be presenting today. What I did in preparation for this is I started reading through some of the scholarly sort of text and biblical texts that really, tell the stories and have translated their stories into modern day academia, for want of a better word. So I looked at the works from a feminist biblical criticism, through the works of Tribble, Martinez, Brenner, and Nickelsberg. And you'll see this sort of coming out through some of the quotations that I've looked at. So they call out an androcentric interpretation, a worldview that is male-centered, assuming male's experience is the normative human experience. And when we think about feminist biblical criticism, we're really looking at an approach of studying the Bible that focuses on how gender, and especially women's roles and experiences, are presented, represented, and interpreted, and sometimes overlooked in biblical texts. And then I looked at it through the lens of gender and power theory, which is more that aligns more with the work that I do on a day-to-day basis through some of the papers of Butler, Foucault, and Exum. When we think about gender and power theory, we think it's a way of analyzing how power is distributed between men and women in different genders in society, and how these power relationships shape roles, behavior, and opportunities. In particular, how they shape opportunities for women and how these are perceived. So it sees gender as identity and power as constructed through discourse. It's not fixed, it's not natural, and it's not inherent. And then I looked at it through the lens of feminist ethics of care and looked at some of the work of Gilligan and Bayer. And when we look at this, we're looking at sort of a moral reasoning, which is relational and care-based. And this really draws out particularly you can immediately identify with some of the story of Ruth here, but it also will look at how this really sort of applies to Judith as well. It centers relationships, responsibility, empathy, and interdependence in the lived experiences of women. These papers that I have used will be shared with part of the PowerPoint presentation as well. I know most of you know this, but I just wanted to walk through the story of Ruth, and I will do the same with Judith, just to position ourselves so that we can think about how we're applying this to these lenses that I'm going to look at. So in the story of Ruth, Naomi, an Israelite woman, she was the mother of Ruth. She loses her husband and both sons while living in Moab. She decides to turn to Bethlehem, and she has a conversation with both of her daughter-in-laws. She pretty much begs them to leave her and to get on with their life. One daughter-in-law, Orpah, returns home, and Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law, refuses to leave her. So they both return to Bethlehem. Ruth goes into the fields gleaning grain, which is a provision in Israelite law for the poor and for the foreigner, somebody who's external to that normal community. So in this, there are potential experiences of exclusion, isolation, and Ruth feeling inferior to the surroundings and community around her. She happens to glean in the field of Boaz, a wealthy relative of Naomi's late husband. At Naomi's instruction, Ruth approaches Boaz at night on the threshing floor and asks him to spread his cloak over her. This is a legal request invoking the kinsman redeemer custom. Boaz agrees to act on her behalf. And through this sort of redemption and lineage, we're now seeing that Boaz redeems Naomi's land, so the mother-in-law, and marries Ruth. Here we can see Ruth as a role in a role of a rescuer, perhaps. Ruth bears a son, Obed, who becomes the grandfather of King David. The genealogy of the Messiah runs through Ruth's act of loyalty. So I think that loyalty is really the key here. And there's the famous proverb, where you go, I will go, and where you will stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And this is what Ruth says to Naomi when she's making the decision to stay with her. So when we look at this through a sort of feminist or gender lens, I'm calling this the feminist ambiguity of Ruth. On the one hand, she's doubly marginalized. Ruth is positioned as a foreign woman entering Bethlehem's social and economic structures. She's marginalized, firstly in the context of this patriotic sort of society that she's living in, and secondly as a Moabitess within a Jewish ethnic exclusivism. All echoes of Moab in Hebrew memory were pejorative. This is what Martin is saying, meaning that Moab was consistently remembered negatively. So where she was actually from was remembered very negatively and perceived very negatively in the land that she was actually now living and working in. So consider that marginalization that she experienced. She then took on an initiative role in the service of men. This is characterized where she consistently moves in response to others, just perhaps demonstrating humility, perhaps demonstrating submissiveness. Naomi instructs Ruth to wash, perfume herself, and put on her best clothes in a way to seduce Boaz. She uncovers his feet and lies down. And this text is written with some sort of degree of sexual tension, ambiguity, and symbolic language. Exum describes this as her courage is praised because it promotes the patriarchal worldview. And I think that's an interesting position. And when I read this and thought about it, these words of obedience and submissiveness came through very strongly to me. And I don't think that's how it's supposed to be perceived from a feminist perspective, but that's what radiated through me. And then I looked for this obedience through text, and it doesn't come through strongly. This sort of sense of obedience of Ruth in following Naomi's instructions doesn't come through strongly, and it's not something that comes out very strongly in academic text. The Hess paradox. So Ruth is described as having this sort of radical fidelity to Naomi and represents the love and fidelity that can create a family bond without males. Yet the narrative conscripts this love, loyalty to commitment into producing a male heir through the lineage of David, and deeply engaging with his new ethnicity. So she really moves and shifts from that marginalization where she first enters into as a Moab, but then takes on this new sort of ethnicity and identity as she bears a son. The heroine or instrument. So Martinez cautions that reclaiming biblical women for modern feminist purposes risks anachronism and distortion. In contrast, Tribble argues that the text itself can be read against this patriarchal grain. So taken together, these perspectives show that the narrative holds both constraints and possibilities simultaneously. So this sort of tension between a feminist lens and a submissive lens is very tense throughout this example. I think one of the things that comes through really strongly through this example is the story of Ruth and Naomi and their solidarity and this sense of strategy, the strategy of Naomi in the way that she, for want of a better word, uses Ruth as a conduit to go through Boaz to reclaim the land and lineage that she has lost. So the opportunity that was lost is reclaimed. So Ruth's pledge to Naomi is a sort of covenant with a woman, a radical act of female loyalty that precedes and exceeds any religious conversion. Farewell and Gunn argue that Ruth's loyalty is not sentimental devotion, but a strategic narrative shaping an act of agency that disrupts these social expectations and reconfigures power within that patriarchal world. I like the way that this is framed. I like the sense of strategy. When I saw this framing, I could see how this is coming out through a stronger lens of feminism when I read Farewell and Gunn's paper. Ruth mediates between two older people. She plays a wife to Boaz and simultaneously a husband to Naomi. So she's occupying both these male and female roles simultaneously. And what we mean by that is that while she's playing the role to Boaz of bearing a son, she's also providing stability, providing money for Naomi, which is typically seen as the role of a man. For Tribble, this is an emotional and theological center of the book. Women forming covenant with each other, not through men. Their bond drives every decision and outcome. And this is unusual in biblical narrative where women are typically defined in relation to men. Let's just pause for a moment and reflect on what we've heard about Ruth before we move to Judith, a very different story and a very different set of circumstances. And as I explained, this is not a Bible story that is familiar to me. And also this is the type of story that I would struggle with. And in conversations with Susie before, she knows that these types of sort of violent representations in the Bible are something that don't sit comfortably with me. So in this sort of more the way that the Bible is framed and the way that I've come to learn and understand it, this violence is carried out by men. And when you see it from the perspective of a woman, it's taken me a while to sort of resonate with this story. So the story of Judith, the siege of Beth-Ulia. Holofernes, a general of the Assyrian army under King Nebuchadnezzar, besieges the Jewish town of Bethulia and cuts off its water supply. So the community, the people are dying of thirst. The elders prepare to surrender in 5 days if God does not intervene. So a deeply religious, faithful community who are not seeing any form of faith intervention, any sort of solution that's coming to their aid. Judith, who lives in the community, is a beautiful, wealthy, devout widow. She rebukes the elders for their lack of faith and announces she will act. She prays, removes her widow's mourning clothes, bathes, anoints herself, and puts on her finest clothes and jewelry and walks into the camp. In some stories, she walks in singularly. In other representations, she walks with her maid. And if you see a lot of the art that has been produced out of this, there are two very sort of distinct representations. One where the maid is prominent, and one where she's alone. So deception and decapitation over several nights. Judith charms Holofernes, who desires her, while maintaining her religious observances. On the night he expects to sleep with her, he falls into a drunken sleep. Judith takes his sword and cuts off his head. She returns to Bethulia with her head in a food bag and presents it to her community. So in this sort of sense of victory and aftermath, the Israelite army displays Holofernes' head. The Assyrians, discovering their general is dead, flee in panic. Israel is saved. Judith is celebrated as a heroine and blessed by the high priest. She returns home and remains celibate, frees her from her maidservant, and distributes her own property. So she doesn't take on a celebratory life as a heroine as such. She continues her deeply spiritual and faithful practice, and does not change in response to her actions or what she's done. It was an act in time, in a moment that's carried out. The Lord Almighty has foiled them by the hand of a woman, for their mighty one did not fall by the hands of a young man. So this is a really strong text. This is recognizing the role that a woman played in this victory, if you like. So Judith is a woman who overturns the structures of male power by using the very tools of patriarchy that's been given to her. This is what Exon says in his paper in 1993. So the way that Judith uses violence in service of faith, Judith's act is not private vengeance. It's a holy war. She prays before she kills. The community blesses her upon her return, and the text presents political violence as divinely sanctioned when it protects God's people. In many ways, this is how the stories have played out from male models within the Bible as well. So it sits quite comfortably, within that framework of the acceptance of violence in a way to restore faith, restore these structures of Christianity. The body as a weapon. So Judith weaponizes her beauty, her femininity, and her sexuality deliberately and strategically. Her beautification ritual precedes her prayer. So appearance and deception are tools of her warfare. And then in this case, they're not signs of moral weakness or inequality in any way. Piety and transgression together. Judith maintains her religious observances. We've spoken about this. She fasts, she prays, dietary laws, even while planning and executing the murder that she committed. So the text holds really deeply this sort of sense of piety and extreme transgression in the same character without contradiction. And then female autonomy and resolution. Uniquely, Judith's story doesn't end in heroicism, as I've explained. It doesn't end in a marriage. It doesn't end with her obtaining a man. She's not saved or rescued by men in any way. She returns home, remains celibate, and distributes equitably her property and frees her maidservant. So in many ways, she's presented as one of the most autonomous women in biblical literature. There's a lot of sort of feminist critical debate on Judith. So there's some very positive readings, there's some very negative ways that it's interpreted. And Thimidius Keith has a sort of third way where the intersection of sort of negativity and positivity is reflected in the same way. So what is presented is it's especially striking for its feminism. The author chose a woman as a protagonist and depicted her as consistently superior to men all round, which is extremely rare in the context of the Bible. Narito presents Judith as a liberation theology, God's affirmation that women can lead the struggle against oppression. God wants people to be free from all forms of domination. And it's an interesting way that Judith is used in this way to be part of that picture of the release of domination. From a negative perspective, Stocker writes, despite its own thematics, the Book of Judith cannot afford to be feminist. Judith was merely an instrument, reliving out true patriarchal power. Her femininity proves God's masculinity. I think this is really interesting because it's very firmly positioning Judith within those male leaders that we see who carry out violence within the Bible, and it's an interesting perspective that is what's happened. She's not framed as a woman in any way in this case. Mill says Judith is far from a feminist heroine. She identifies with male models, identifies against female characters, and presents herself completely from a male patriarchal perspective. And then a third way of looking at this from both positive and negative feminist readings is still sort of falling into the trap of judging Judith in the simple terms of whether it was good or bad, which ends up repeating the same rigid, closed-off way of interpreting the text that traditional male-centered readings use. Another approach holds the text contradictions that it finds them. The androgynous Judith as a model for reintegration of male and female elements in both men and women. So I think we can come back to this in some of the discussion, and I'm sure Susie will pick up on some of this debate here, but I think it's extremely interesting that there were these distinct categories of the way that Judith has been studied, and they're still trying to fit into these sort of masculinity, femininity sort of boxes in a way that Ruth hasn't been. I did my own analysis for this. This is the type of work that I do on a day-to-day basis, and I use Kabir's social and gender framework. So I looked at this from. I did this a sort of comparison. I took the framework which has elements of resources and agency and achievements, and I really wanted to look at where Ruth sat and where Judith sat within that. So if we look at the resources from a material and social perspective, Ruth was minimal. She was a widower, a foreigner. She's presented with no land, no kinship, no protection. Her only social resource was her loyalty to Naomi, which she used strategically. And her human resource, if you will, was the way that she held her resilience in a form of strategy that both served Boaz and Naomi. Judith, on the other hand, was a greater figure, if you like, in terms of her wealth. She was a wealthy widow. She owned property. She had servants. Her social resource was her beauty and her status within the community. But in this time, when you look at her human resource, she expressed courage and faith in God in order to carry out the seduction and the murder, and it was the faith that carried her forward to give her the courage to do this. From an agency perspective, when we look at agency, we're looking at ability to make decisions freely, the autonomy or the power to act. From Ruth, she acts from within the system. She chooses loyalty over return. She initiates threshing. So she goes into a system and a structure that's unfamiliar to her, and she carries out the acts within the community, within the role, within the structure as she should. So she follows the rules, if you like. In that way, it was strategic, but it demonstrated the normalization, if you like, of the new place that she was living. So this agency itself was directed to Naomi initially. With Judith, she acts outside of the system. That comes across quite clearly. She devises and executes the plan alone. She uses beauty as a tactical weapon. She uses transgression as her agency, and the agency is directed to not what will necessarily benefit her, as perhaps Ruth and in Ruth and Naomi's case, but what is going to happen to her community. And in terms of achievements, we look at the achievements, security for herself from the perspective of Ruth, security for herself and Naomi. She's praised for her loyalty. She becomes an ancestor of David, and she's instrumentalized by this narrative. Judith, on the other hand, has liberation of her people. She's named as a leader. There is a degree of heroism, but it's short-lived, and then it's politically erased, and her achievement is absorbed by God's glory, and the story is silenced. It's not a story that is commonly talked about, and it's much more silenced in the way that Ruth's story has been. This is some of the more scholarly discussions around power, the body, and gender performance. So if we look at gender as performance, and we do a comparison of Ruth and Judith. Judith performs within femininity, but within that patriarchal norms. She gleans, she submits, she marries, but her declaration to Naomi exceeds that script. Her hest is both normative compliance and subversive of surplus. And this is a perspective of Butler, who writes around from that very strong sort of gender lens. On the other hand, Judith's beautification ritual is explicitly performative. She dresses to deceive. So she's using the norms of, I guess, the ordered structure of norms of women to seduce. Her beauty is a weapon. It's not her identity. It's not how she identifies, but she uses it in a performance in order to sort of weaponize to fulfill the outcome of murder. And if we look through the work of Foucault, so power through the body. So Ruth's body is a site of both vulnerability and agency, subjected to potential sexual harassment in the fields, instrumentalized by Naomi, desired by Boaz. Yet she uses the threshing floor to encounter to legal claim and protection on her own terms. Judith used her body as primarily the instrument of national salvation. Her sandal ravished eyes, her beauty captivates his mind, and the sword severed his neck. The body that is objectified is the same body that kills. And then when we look at intersectionality, gender and ethnicity, Ruth is marginalized as a woman, as a Moabitess, the descendant of deception and incest in Israelite memory. Her faithfulness is praised precisely because it serves Israelite ethnocentrism, a double standard that text never actually interrogates. On the other hand, Judith is a Jewish widow. Her power derives partly from her ethnic insider status. She fights for Israel's purity against a foreign threat, but her methods transgress every gender norm that purity culture imposes on women. And purity culture, as you know, comes through very strongly through biblical texts and how it lives out in women and today. I have a quick comparative synthesis that we can look at through the dimensions of mode of agency. Ruth has strategic compliance and works within and through patriarchal structures via loyalty, solidarity, and negotiation. Ruth is a more radical transgression. She crosses every gender, social, and military boundary. She kills her way to liberation. Relationship to religion. East is a lived theology, loyalty to persons over loyalty in institutions. God is absent but present in the female covenant. From the perspective of Judith, deception is sanctified. Lies and seduction are endorsed by God and community as warfare for divine honor. And then we've talked about the use of body and how both women use their body in a sense. For Ruth, the body's a site of vulnerability. It's sort of instrumentalized towards a survival mechanism to gain the attention of men in order to survive, have financial security and home security and access to land. With Judith, the body is a weapon, her beauty is sexualized, and physical violence is deployed as this deliberate strategic instruments in one single act. So it happens quickly, even though there has been a build-up to this over time. So narrative and resolution, absorbed back into the patriarchal structure, married, reproduced, and has a lineage, and the system itself claims her. Judith, on the other hand, returns home and is politically marginalized. From a feminist legacy, Ruth's feminist legacy is contested. Tribal disputes this feminism of Ruth. Martinez resists that reclamation. The texts hold both readings in this sort of productive tension of whether Ruth is actually a feminist within biblical texts, or whether it's actually sort of more falls into a more normalized patriarchal structure. The difference that stands out, obviously, is that relationship and that loyalty and solidarity towards Naomi. The feminist legacy is also contested on behalf of Judith as well. It's rejected because it's so patriarchal. It's the way that she acts out is violence. She uses her weapons in the same way that men use weapons to gain power. On the other hand, there is the insistence on the interpretive humility and open meaning in the way that it's done, not necessarily for her, but because of the community. From a theological claim perspective, divine history is shaped by marginalized women. The Messianic genealogy runs through female acts of hest and transgression. And when we come to Judith, God acts through the weakness of an instrument, but whose definition of weakness, Judith's femininity may be ironic, maybe an ironic strength. So I think in conclusion, what Ruth and Judith really together illuminate is neither text is simply for or against women. Both are sites of struggle in which female agency and patriarchal conscription coexist without resolution, and that feminist interpretation that refuses to hold this tension reproduces the very binarism it contests. Ruth and Judith are a model of two modes of different power within women. Women's power under patriarchy, navigating from within, and solidarity and strategic compliance, and transgressing this through the form of violence and deception and weaponization of femininity itself through the acts of Judith. Religion functions in both texts as a primary structure of constraint and the primary vocabulary of liberation. Women are confined by its laws and yet empowered by its theology, almost simultaneously in the same act. The feminist ethics of interpretation, justice, care, and autonomy and selfhood demands that we read this text within historical accountability, with humility and openness to the ordinary reader's interpretive right, including pre-critical and non-Western readings. So really thinking about whether the context of time and when these acts actually took place, whether they actually have any place and relativism in the context that we live today. Are they relatable? And I would like to end the session here. Christian, would you like me to close in prayer now as we reflect on this?
Yes, your session, if you would like to close with prayer at this point.
I can do that. Okay. Gracious God, you who meet women in the fields of survival and on the front lines of courage, be present with us as we gather in honest conversation. We remember Ruth, whose steadfast love carried her across borders into new belonging. Teach us her courage, the quiet, persistent strength that chooses loyalty, dignity, and hope even in uncertainty. We remember Judith, whose fierce resolve rose from a world that left her few choices. Help us hold her story with care, not to glorify violence, but to honor the truth that women's strengths take many forms in unjust systems. Give us wisdom to see the difference between liberation and harm, and the compassion to sit with these stories that unsettle us. As we speak together, open our hearts to one another's experience, open our minds to perspectives different from our own, and open our spirits to the possibility of transformation. May our dialogue be brave, our listening generous, and our community a place where every woman's voice, gentle or fierce, weary or bold, is welcomed and respected. The Holy One, guide us in the work of justice, rooted in love, grounded in truth, and shaped by the many ways women show strength in this world. Amen.
Are you there, Christian? Your video seems to have gone blank.